Blood dripped from Derek Morrison's broken nose onto the asphalt as he stared up at the girl who had just shattered his world. 30 seconds ago, he had been the untouchable king of Millbrook High. Backed by family money and 3 years of unchallenged terror, now he lay defeated by someone he had dismissed as weak. Someone he had tormented with racist slurs and systematic humiliation. Kesha Williams stood over him, her fists still clenched. 8 years of suppressed rage finally unleashed, but this moment of violence was just the beginning. What started as protection, money demands would explode into viral videos, false criminal charges, and a legal battle that would expose the rot at the heart of an entire community. One girl's refusal to pay tribute would ignite a war between those who profit from fear and those who dare to stand against it. What would you do when silence becomes complicity? Kesha Williams stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulders that carried themselves with unconscious grace, despite the weight of recent upheaval. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed older than her 17 years, reflecting a wisdom earned through trials that most teenagers never face. She wore simple clothes that day, a navy blue sweater and jeans that had seen better days. But somehow, she carried herself with a dignity that expensive clothing could never provide. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. No jewelry, except for a small silver pendant that caught the light when she moved. The pendant was her most treasured possession, a gift from her grandmother before the old woman passed away 3 years ago. It was shaped like a lotus flower, its petals etched with delicate precision. Her grandmother had whispered to her as she placed the chain around her neck that lotus flowers bloom most beautifully in the muddiest waters. That strength comes not from avoiding hardship, but from rising through it with grace intact. Kesha touched that pendant now as she walked through the unfamiliar hallways of Millbrook High, her fingers finding comfort in its familiar weight. In her backpack, tucked between textbooks and notebooks, she carried a worn photograph of herself and her grandmother standing together in their old dojo in Detroit. The picture showed 2 generations of Williams women, both wearing black belts, both smiling with quiet confidence. Her grandmother had been the one to introduce her to martial arts, to teach her that true strength was about protecting others, not proving dominance. The old woman had seen something in 8-year-old Kesha, a fire that needed direction, a spirit that needed grounding. Dr. Patricia Williams, her mother, worked the night shift at Millbrook General Hospital, leaving Kesha to navigate this new world largely on her own. They had moved here for a fresh start after her mother's divorce. After the medical practice in Detroit became too painful to maintain following her father's abandonment, Kesha understood the sacrifice her mother had made, leaving behind a successful practice to start over in a small town, where opportunities were limited and prejudices ran deep. As she made her way to the cafeteria that first day, Kesha observed the social ecosystem with the analytical mind her grandmother had taught her to develop. The popular students claimed the center tables like territorial animals, their laughter too loud, their movements too practiced. Athletes dominated one corner, their Letterman jackets like uniforms of privilege. Theater kids clustered near the windows, animated in their discussions of whatever production they were rehearsing. And scattered throughout were the invisible ones, the students who ate alone, who kept their heads down, who had learned that survival meant anonymity. The memory hit her like a physical blow, sudden and unexpected. She was 8 years old again, standing in the doorway of her father's study, watching him pack his belongings into cardboard boxes. He had looked up at her with eyes that couldn't quite meet hers, and said the words that would echo in her mind for years to come. He was leaving, he explained in the careful tone adults use when they're about to shatter a child's world, because he couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The pressure of her mother's success, of living in the shadow of a woman who saved lives while he struggled to sell insurance. But it wasn't just about her mother's career. Though that's what he told everyone who would listen. Kesha had overheard the real conversation the night before. When her parents thought she was asleep, her father had been offered a promotion that would require the family to relocate to a predominantly white suburb, and he had seen it as his chance to escape what he called the limitations of their current life. When her mother refused to abandon her patients and her community for his career advancement, he had made his choice. The betrayal cut deeper than just abandonment. Her father had always been uncomfortable with her martial arts training, had made comments about it being too aggressive for a girl, too masculine. He had wanted her to take ballet or piano lessons, something more fitting for the image he wanted to project of his successful family. Her grandmother had been the one to stand firm, to insist that Kesha's training continue, that the discipline and confidence it provided were more valuable than social acceptability. On the day he left, her father had looked at the photograph on his desk, the one of Kesha receiving her black belt at age 14, and he had shaken his head with something that looked like disappointment. He had packed that photograph at the bottom of a box, buried under tax documents and old business cards, as if her achievement was something to be hidden rather than celebrated. That night, Kesha had found the photograph in the trash outside their house, crumpled but not torn, discarded like everything else her father couldn't understand about the life they had built. Her grandmother had found her crying over that photograph and had sat with her on the floor of their living room, carefully smoothing out the wrinkles in the picture. She had told Kesha that day that some people are so afraid of strength in others that they try to diminish it, to make it small and manageable. But strength, real strength, doesn't diminish when it's attacked. It grows deeper, more rooted, more unshakable. The lotus pendant felt warm against her skin as Derek Morrison approached her table in the cafeteria, his expensive sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. The confidence that came from knowing that his father owned the largest car dealership in town and that his family's donations kept the school's sports programs running. Derek Morrison was everything her father had wanted her to be impressed by. Everything he had valued in the suburban dreams he chased. Tall, blonde, athletic, with the kind of easy charm that opened doors and smoothed over problems. He wore his privilege like a well-tailored jacket, comfortable and perfectly fitted. His Letterman jacket hung on broad shoulders that had never known real hardship, and his smile held the cold calculation of someone who had learned early that intimidation was just another tool for getting what you wanted. The demand for protection money came with practiced ease, as if Derek had made this speech dozens of times before to other students who had dared to enter his territory without permission. His friends Jake and Tommy flanked him like bodyguards, their presence designed to make the request feel less like extortion and more like inevitable reality. Jake Wilson cracked his knuckles with the mechanical precision of someone who had turned intimidation into art, while Tommy Bradley's snicker held just enough malice to make the threat feel personal. When Kesha refused to pay, the cafeteria fell silent with the kind of anticipatory hush that settles over crowds before violence erupts. 200 students became an audience, their faces reflecting everything from concern to entertainment. Some looked ashamed to be witnessing what they recognized as injustice, while others leaned forward with the ghoulish excitement of spectators at a gladiator match. Derek's smile faltered for just a moment, clearly not expecting outright refusal from someone he had already categorized as an easy target. The harassment that followed was methodical and cruel, designed to break her spirit rather than her body. Her locker was sabotaged with gum, jammed into the mechanism, forcing her to struggle with the combination while other students watched and whispered. Her notebooks disappeared from her bag, only to reappear in the hands of Derek's friends, who performed mocking readings of her handwriting for the entertainment of younger students who were too frightened to object. During chemistry class, her safety goggles vanished, forcing her to work with a scratched pair that made it impossible to read measurements clearly. The teacher noticed but said nothing, either unwilling or unable to recognize the systematic nature of what was happening. Every incident had plausible deniability. Every act of sabotage could be explained away as accident or coincidence. Derek and his crew had perfected the art of institutional harassment, staying just below the threshold that would force administrators to act. The edited recording was the masterpiece of Derek's campaign, a digital manipulation that turned Kesha's thoughtful commentary on racial injustice into something ugly and inflammatory. He played it during study hall, with the theatrical flair of someone who understood the power of public humiliation. The recording made her sound angry and divisive, twisting her words until they became weapons against her own reputation. Students who had been warming to her presence suddenly looked at her with suspicion and distrust. Marcus Thompson was one of the few who recognized the manipulation, who had been present during the original discussion and could hear the places where Derek had spliced and edited her words, but his voice was lost in the wave of reaction that swept through the study hall, drowned out by the whispers and gasps of students who wanted to believe they had discovered something scandalous. The damage was immediate and devastating, transforming Kesha from a potential friend into a perceived threat in the span of 5 minutes. That night, sitting in her bedroom with the edited recording echoing in her mind, Kesha felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over her like a heavy blanket. She pulled out the photograph of herself and her grandmother, studying the confident smiles that now seemed to belong to different people entirely. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that lotus flowers bloom most beautifully in the muddiest waters. But the mud felt so deep now that she couldn't see the surface anymore. The pendant around her neck felt heavier than usual, as if it were pulling her down rather than lifting her up. She had tried to honor her grandmother's teachings, to respond to hatred with dignity, to meet violence with peace. But dignity felt like weakness when it was met with escalating cruelty, and peace felt like surrender when it was interpreted as defeat. Her hands shook as she held the photograph, and for the first time since her father's abandonment, she wondered if running away might be the wisest choice. Her mother found her like that, sitting cross-legged on her bed with tears streaming down her face, and her most precious possessions spread out before her like artifacts from a life she was considering leaving behind. Dr. Patricia Williams had seen enough broken spirits in her years of medical practice to recognize when someone was approaching their breaking point, and she sat down beside her daughter with the patience of someone who understood that healing takes time. They talked through the night, mother and daughter sharing stories about strength and resilience, about the courage it takes to stand up when the whole world seems determined to knock you down. Her mother told her about the patients she had treated, who had survived impossible odds, who had found ways to heal, even when the damage seemed irreversible. She reminded Kesha that her grandmother had faced her own battles with grace and determination, that the woman who had taught her to fight had also taught her when fighting was necessary. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Kesha made her decision. She would not run, would not let Derek's cruelty drive her from another home. But she would also not continue to absorb punishment in the name of turning the other cheek. When Derek and his friends approached her in the parking lot that afternoon, she was ready. The fight was swift and decisive. 8 years of training, unleashed with surgical precision. Derek's size advantage meant nothing against technique honed through thousands of hours of practice. Jake's aggressive posturing crumbled When met with movements that flowed like water around his clumsy attempts at intimidation, Tommy's sneer disappeared when he found himself on the asphalt, his ribs aching from an elbow strike that had been delivered with the efficiency of a master craftsman. When it was over, Derek lay face down on the asphalt with Kesha's knee between his shoulder blades, his nose bleeding freely and his confidence shattered. The small crowd of witnesses stood in stunned silence, their phones forgotten in their hands as they processed what they had just seen. This was not the weak, isolated girl they had expected to see humiliated. This was someone who had been underestimated by people who mistook kindness for weakness. But even as Derek agreed to leave her alone, even as his friends nursed their wounds and their damaged pride, Kesha knew that the real battle was just beginning. The video of the bus stop incident would make her a viral sensation within hours, transforming her from a local story into a national symbol. The edited recording that had seemed so damaging would pale in comparison to the clear evidence of her defending younger students from harassment and assault. Within 24 hours, Derek and his allies would file false police reports, claiming they had been the victims of unprovoked assault. They would coordinate their stories with the help of expensive lawyers and family connections, painting Kesha as a dangerous individual who used her martial arts training to terrorize innocent students. The legal system would become their weapon of choice, the courtroom, their preferred battlefield. But they had not counted on the power of truth, on the strength of a community that had finally found someone willing to stand up to institutional bullying. Students who had suffered in silence for years would find their voices. Parents, who had watched their children diminish under harassment, would demand justice. The very system that Derek's family had always relied on to protect their privilege would become the instrument of their exposure. The trial would reveal the extent of the harassment campaign, the systematic nature of the abuse that had been ignored by administrators and enabled by indifferent adults. Jessica's unedited video would provide irrefutable evidence of who had really been the aggressor at the bus stop. The original recording of Kesha's English class discussion would expose Derek's manipulation for what it was: a calculated attempt to destroy someone's reputation through digital deception. Judge Patricia Thompson would not just find Kesha innocent of all charges. She would recommend perjury investigations against the boys who had lied under oath. The community that had once seemed ready to sacrifice her for the sake of social peace would rally to her defense, recognizing that her courage had given them permission to confront problems they had been ignoring for too long. In the months that followed, Kesha's self-defense program would transform not just Millbrook High but schools throughout the district. Students who had once walked the hallways in fear would learn to carry themselves with confidence. Bullies who had operated with impunity would find their tactics no longer effective against targets who refused to be victims. But perhaps the most profound change would be in Kesha herself. The girl who had arrived in Millbrook hoping to avoid attention would discover that sometimes the most important battles choose you rather than the other way around. She would learn that true strength is not about avoiding conflict, but about standing up for what is right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Standing in that same cafeteria 6 months later, surrounded by students who had found their voices and their courage, Kesha would touch the lotus pendant at her throat and hear her grandmother's voice, reminding her that the most beautiful flowers bloom in the muddiest waters. She had not sought to become a symbol or a leader, but she had discovered that sometimes the world needs people who are willing to take a stand when everyone else is looking the other way. The photograph of herself and her grandmother, once wrinkled and discarded, now sat framed on her desk at home. A reminder that strength is not diminished when it is attacked, but grows deeper and more unshakable. Some battles are won not with power, but with dignity. If you were Hare, would you forgive?